The president and this administration should not be afraid to call out China when it comes to severe human rights violations.
I think the Chinese, like any negotiators, are trying to get the best deal they can for China. What that means is they're not really interested in cutting back on the issues of intellectual property theft and things like that, because that's really almost structural. It's almost baked into their system.
When you're negotiating with somebody, you need to know that the other person is negotiating in good faith.
They're studying the global environment, and they're realizing that as muscular as they are economically, the second largest economy, that their political influence and their military capabilities should be commensurate with that. And if you listen to Xi, he talks about actually being the world leader.
The U.S. administration has been tough in New York all week, raising a whole bunch of issues, including Chinese really infiltration of UN organizations. They have over 1,000 employees there. They have people in leadership positions way out of proportion to other countries.
China is very much transitioning from being a kind of a klepto economy where they steal intellectual property and other technological capabilities to actually being able to innovate on their own.
We are dealing here with a rising superpower that has ambitions to match the United States in terms of overall military capability by the middle of the century. It's already investing about $190 billion a year.
It's time for Americans to start asking questions of these businesses. I mean, look, the NBA seem to be much more concerned about the money coming into their bank accounts than they even do defending the rights of a U.S. citizen for free speech.
We're seeing unbelievable persecution of Christians, crosses being torn down, Bibles being burned. This is really reminiscent of human rights abuses we were seeing during the Cultural Revolution.
As China goes out with the Belt and Road, or here buy some Huawei products, and on the back end they say, don't worry about us. We just want to do good in the world. We know that's a lie. They lie to the entire world. They break their promises, and they are not a force for good.
Thank you for joining us for our panel on the challenge of China. As I mentioned briefly a few minutes ago, China dominates the news. China seems to be everywhere. It's in our trade talks, it's in our national security, it's even worked its way into our sports. There's an old saying attributed to Napoleon. It's probably not true, but it's like the quotes from Churchill. Most of them are not true, but it's a good one. And that is, let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world. Well, China is no longer sleeping. It's wide awake, and it's making a tremendous strides in its economy, and it's spreading its reach and its influence all across the globe. We know for certain that China's leader, President Xi Jinping, has a strategy. He has a plan, and his dream is to make China a world power. China has a new and very confident sense of itself, and we best understand what that sense is if we should ever hope to deal with it. The problem with China, like with a lot of countries, frankly, is that it speaks one way and it acts another. It talks of good relations with the United States as a, quote, win-win situation for both of our countries. But that's not the way China is acting. They are in reality trying to change the fundamentals of the international order that we as Americans helped create. It's economics, in economics and technology, security and trade. They are trying to change the rules and norms of that order in their favor. So yes, it's a win-win situation, but that's what they really mean is that they win twice, and that means that we lose. They are looking for a reckoning with history, which in their minds will rectify the humiliations of the past, and that makes them very determined and frankly very stubborn, quite difficult to deal with, and also very frankly not terribly honest. As always, with anything in international affairs, it's a complicated situation. China is complicated, and how we respond to them is not as obvious as it might seem. Are they an outright threat that must be contained and actually stopped? Or are they just a competitor that needs to be managed? They are a rising power, we all know that, but they're not a supergiant. They've got their problems, and we need to understand what their problems are. The temptation is to fall back on models that we already have had in our history. World War II, the Cold War. But are they really the right models in dealing with China? To help us answer these questions about China, we have with us this morning the Heritage Foundation's team on China. They are working on a report that will outline a new comprehensive strategy to deal with China. They are among the smartest people in the country working on this issue, and you are in for a real treat. Dean Cheng is a senior research fellow in the Asian Studies Center. He's an expert on China's political and security affairs. Klon Kitchen is a senior research fellow specializing in science, technology, and national security. And David Shedd is our visiting fellow and a former acting director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. So let me start with you, Dean. I'd like to ask each one of you to make a very short 2-minute statement about the problem so we properly understand it, and then we'll go into some specific questions. Dean.
So I think the most important thing to understand about how different China is as a challenge for the United States is that we have this hope that we can do whole of government, that we can get the State Department and DOD and the White House and Congress to all work together. And China is very much a whole of society approach because the Chinese Communist Party has reach across all aspects of society, whether it's business, whether it's the government, whether it's the military. You know, the Heritage Foundation stands for civil society. There is no equivalent to civil society in China. And so as a result, whether it's Huawei, whether it's Costco, not the retailer, but the Chinese shipping entity, whether it's ZTE, all of those entities respond to what the party tells it to do. And that means that whether it's graduate students at universities, whether it's businessmen, whether it's academics, whether it's the state-owned press, they respond to higher level instruction and authority in a way that really we, as a free society, are not going to be able to do.
Klon?
Yeah, I'm going to briefly build on that. So my fundamental point is that China is deliberately and increasingly effectively fusing its public and private sectors to achieve their strategic aims. And it is increasing both in frequency and scale to the point to where the United States must, if it wants to thrive politically and economically going forward, recognize the political and economic distortions that this civil-military fusion strategy produces, and then systematically push it back. Now, as has already been said, our response is not going to be able to simply import previous strategies because unlike, for example, the Soviet Union, our economics are intimately integrated with those of the Chinese. And so that requires a level of sophistication and nuance and depth of insight and, frankly, resolve that is going to demand much of us. I think we're ready for it, but that's a fundamental point that I think is essential for this conversation.
Thank you, Klon.
On October 1st of this year, the Chinese Communist Party celebrated 70 years. 30-some years ago, Deng Xiaoping introduced a model in which they could combine economic advances in building inherently capitalism, defined by the Chinese, by the way, while at the same time maintaining the control of the Chinese Communist Party. The only way that they can actually muddle through that balance, if you will, is by having a very strong Ministry of State Security and a security apparatus that is enabled by what Klon talked about in terms of the public-private partnership on technologies. And the threat therein is that it combines old-fashioned security apparatus with technology. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that as we look at Hong Kong and what's occurring there. In net sum, China's future is going to be defined by navigating between this balance of openness, if you will, pertaining to the economic piece, while at the same time a highly and definite suppressive regime when it comes to the authoritarian means in which it, quote unquote, manages its people of 1.4 billion.
Thank you, Dean. Dean, it's common for all of us to conclude that China is a threat to the United States. But you're already hearing from the different dimensions in which they operate, in technology and security and trade, that this is a new problem for us that we have not faced before in our history, at least of this dimension. Can you describe for everyone the nature of the Chinese threat, both materially and also geopolitically? In other words, from the point of view of their global challenge.
So China, perhaps the best word to describe the threat that is posed by China is comprehensive, because it covers so many different aspects. And you've heard some of that up here. So the easiest part in some ways is the military threat. I think anyone who has seen, and we saw a little bit on the video there, right? New Chinese missiles, Chinese aircraft carriers, Chinese fighter jets. They have 2 stealth programs, by the way. That is an obvious threat. But another aspect to it is the political threat. We see the Chinese creating Confucius Institutes, which are, by the way, at the end of the day, funded by an arm of the Chinese state, setting up branches in universities around the world, giving out free money. But money's never actually free, right? So all of a sudden, those universities start getting a little bit of pressure on what kind of classes to teach or what kind of speakers to invite. In general, don't invite the Dalai Lama, for example. You have economic and technological threats. The Chinese, it's important to recognize, are capable of innovation. We sometimes think if you're an authoritarian government, you can't innovate. But China is now leading the world in areas like quantum computing and artificial intelligence and certain aspects of their space program. They landed on the far side of the moon, something no other nation has done. So we see a very comprehensive threat, but let me note here, we also see comprehensive weaknesses. The Chinese military, we've seen all these cool new pictures. The Chinese spend more on internal security than they do on external security, meaning they spend more money surveilling their own population, checking every email, checking every website, than they do producing aircraft carriers and fighter jets.
Klon, Dean mentioned the advances that China's making in technology, artificial intelligence, quantum computing and the like. I remember 10, 15 years ago when I was at the United Nations and people talked about China in the UN system as being a developing country. They didn't have enough money to compete with the United States or others in the West. Well, now it's a very different story. They've got a lot of money and they're making advances in cutting edge technologies that frankly are ahead of us in some areas. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think the first thing to understand is that China is like every other country in the history of the world in the sense that it seeks to amass and then wield geopolitical influence toward its own strategic ends. And what China has done, I think quite correctly, is it has concluded that leading in certain technological sectors is going to be essential for them to realize their strategic aims going forward. And they've specifically, the great thing about the Chinese is that they're very kind in putting their strategies in these white papers. And they even translate them in English. So it's not difficult to kind of discern what their intentions are. And they have discussed specifically 10 key technological industries in which they have made the assessment that we need to be leading, a top player in these industries, if we want to have the type of national competitiveness and capability to lead in the future. And frankly, we would assess that as being largely correct. These are the same industries that the United States has led in and seeks to continue to lead in for the same purposes. The difference is that the Chinese government has pulled together a specific strategy, as I've already mentioned, called civil-military fusion, where it deliberately couples its government with its industry, such that the industry has become an extension of the state. So we'll talk about a number of different Chinese companies, some of which have already been mentioned, but Huawei and ZTE and the like. These are, in one sense, money-making ventures that build increasingly capable technological offerings. At the same time, both legally and technologically, These companies operate as extensions of the Chinese government's intelligence enterprise. And so as companies like Huawei build their infrastructure across the globe, it is entirely correct to recognize that infrastructure as an extension of the Chinese government's espionage and national security infrastructure. They're one and the same. And then finally, the kind of key transition that we're observing at this very moment is that for a while, the Chinese were simply stealing intellectual property and parroting innovation as a way of being competitive. Well, they've done that long enough, and they've done that in a sufficiently unchallenged way to where now they are legitimately innovating. They are legitimately producing their own companies with their own proprietary technology that at times is either a peer or in fact occasionally sometimes superior to American offerings. And that's a problem, not just for economic competitiveness, but for this broader strategic aim that they're exercising. There's every reason to take this challenge seriously. And it's not simply enough to presume that the American century going forward is an inevitability.
Thank you, Klon. David, the protests in Hong Kong are growing. There's been some instances of some violence. For the most part, Hong Kong, the police of Hong Kong have handled the security side of that. Can you talk a little bit more about what's going on in Hong Kong, and what are the chances that China's security services might get involved?
Well, I would modify the last part of your question and say they're absolutely already involved. What are the chances of it increasing? I want to pick up on Dean's point about what the greatest concern is to the Chinese leadership led by Xi Jinping. Xi probably does not sleep well at night, far more over the issue of domestic security, and seeing a repeat in his worst dreams or in his nightmares of a Tiananmen of 30 years ago being repeated. When it looks at the agreement with the United Kingdom of 1997, in which that turnover of Hong Kong took place, of one nation, two systems, it sees unraveling a certain aspect of the control that they hoped that by now they would achieve in Hong Kong, and absolutely prevent from occurring in Taiwan. So in Hong Kong, if you take the predicate or the catalyst for what happens in June, which is an extradition law, it has since expanded considerably to other issues related to the democratic movement in Hong Kong, counted in the hundreds of thousands, if not low millions, of that population in terms of being in favor of that. I predicted in June and July that it was highly unlikely that you would see tanks go into Hong Kong, from Shenzhen and from mainland China down into Hong Kong. And the reason for that is the capabilities of the security services. And just to give you context, there's the Ministry of State Security, and then there are 31 bureaus throughout China at the provincial level, all that work just like every aspect of what you've heard here in a combined form, not only to support the state of China, but the Communist Party. And their capabilities now with facial recognition and biometrics and all the sorts of things that are being applied in Hong Kong are making it far more likely to see a war of attrition against the democratic movements of Hong Kong as opposed to a military action. I presume, do not know, but I presume that in Beijing, the powers that be have made a decision that the cost of doing a military excursion into Hong Kong would be worse. I will never say they will never do it, but I think they have the security apparatus, and what they hope for is that this does not occur in Taiwan.
Okay. Dean, we have time for one more question before I go to the audience and ask them to give us their questions. We were talking backstage about this distinction between containing China and managing it as a competitor. It sounds a little wonky in the words that we're using, but there's actually a whole different approach to China between trying to contain and stop them on the one hand and trying to deal with them and manage them on the other. Can you say a few words about that?
So you started your comments with some quotes, so I'm going to make one here. It's been said that generals always try to fight the last war. And I think that among bureaucrats, they're always trying to implement the last policy. And so containment for the Soviet Union meant stopping them. Stopping them in Europe through NATO, stopping them in the Far East through war in Korea and Vietnam. It meant stopping them pretty much everywhere, politically, militarily, diplomatically, economically. And the easier part there was that the Soviets didn't trade with anyone. So there weren't any real interest groups that were affected by containment. China is a trading power with every country. You cannot contain a country that is the leading trading partner for Germany, for Japan, for Taiwan. What we end up, and with ourselves. So for us, it's a very easy and very wrong idea that somehow we can just bottle up China the way we did the Soviet Union. Because the Soviets, in a weird way, wanted to be bottled up. They didn't trade with anyone else. They didn't have to. They didn't try to. China, because of this comprehensive approach to the rest of the world, is a competitor everywhere. There are going to be people in Taiwan who will oppose containment, never mind Japan or Germany, or here in the United States. And so for us, we need to compete with them. We need to recognize that there are a lot of areas, human rights, the military, security, where we don't see eye to eye and where China is frankly a threat. And there we need to stop them. But we also need to recognize that there are economic interests, ranging from whether or not you have a flat screen TV or 3 or 4, to whether or not people can afford to have 1 or more laptops. Are you prepared to pay $3,000 for your cell phone as opposed to however much you have so far? That's the essence. Competition where we recognize that there are areas of shared interest as well as areas where we don't have shared interest.
Thank you. Great. Let's go to the audience now to get some questions from all of you. I believe we have people standing by with microphones. If you would like to ask a question, raise your hand. The lights are a little bit, good, thank you, because I couldn't see anything. Yes, sir, right here. Mic is coming.
I'm Bob Lewitt from Florida and upstate New York. Schumpeter talked about creative destruction in capitalism, which we have experienced, and we've gone through many cycles in our industry. If China talks about its own capitalism, in quotes basically, do they run the danger of having that creative destruction overcome their system?
Go ahead.
That is one of the fears within the Chinese system. In fact, if you look at the Fortune 500 and you go back 100 years, you'll see that the Fortune 500 of today has a whole lot of companies that didn't exist in, say, 1919, and a whole lot of the companies that did exist in 1919 don't exist today. What we see with the Chinese, for example, with state-owned enterprises, is almost an attempt to prevent that. We see them keeping alive companies that have no prayer of ever making a profit and using the state banking system to keep those companies afloat. They are interested in some aspects of creative destruction, that's why you have the Huaweis and ZTEs, but at the end of the day, the Chinese want to keep a very tight control over the shape and direction of the economy, precisely because letting it go, which by the way would require allowing people to make their own decisions, free of the government's directives, is going to lead first to economic chaos from their perspective, unemployment, ending companies, but 2, you could then wind up with political unrest and revolution.
I would only add to what Dean has said. Listen very carefully when Xi Jinping speaks at Davos, and he talks about globalization. What could be wrong with that? Remember that every sort of comparative word that he uses to capitalism is defined on their terms. So the Belt and Road Initiative And in my old profession, I would call it the black bag money that walks around out of sovereign wealth funds, is for influence for globalization. So it's their definition of capitalism, much as Dean described.
Yeah, it's not capitalism as we know it with a pure profit motive. It after all is a state controlled by a communist party. It's a managed kind of capitalist system where the profit motive and the freedom that's in our system doesn't exist, and that will create, I guess is probably what you're getting at, the internal contradictions that will cause them troubles in the future. I think that's probably true. Back over there. Wait for the microphone, please.
Stephen Metz from Massachusetts. You haven't spoken very much about regional competition, such as from India and into China. Could you kind of touch on those?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, regional?
Yeah, I think India.
When we look at Asia, what we see is a China that first off wants to establish its dominance over that region. For 5,000 years, China was the center of Asia, not necessarily the world. So we see a China that is openly competitive with Japan, and in fact, one of the great threats to the US is China's threat to its neighbors, many of whom are our allies: Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand. With regards to India, one of the great issues there is that despite being neighbors for all of their history, they actually didn't interact all that much for most of their respective histories. The Himalayas really were a giant barrier. So what we are seeing is something very new. Two giant behemoths, very different. China, of course, a communist dictatorship. India, a democracy. Trying to figure out how do you govern, how do you advance 1.3 billion people, each with distinct weaknesses, each with distinct strengths. The problem here for India is that China is also allied with Pakistan. And if you talk to Indian military planners, what they look at is increasingly the concern about a China that between its alliance with Pakistan and the creation of a larger Chinese Navy that now operates in the Indian Ocean, and its first military base, for example, in Djibouti, and will probably be its second military base in Gwadar, encirclement. And so we do need to recognize that we have a lot of shared interests with India, but at the same time, India is, again, a country of thousands of years of its own history and culture and its own interests. So we should be looking for shared interests, but we should probably temper our enthusiasm, if you will, by being realistic about where India is.
Someone else? Okay, right up here, in the front. It's a long walk for the microphone.
There you
go. What is the position, thinking of the Heritage Foundation, on the role and the effectiveness of tariffs in our thwarting the Chinese challenge? And if this persists, assuming re-election and there's no deal very soon, what will be the longer-term impacts on both economies?
The war on
Everybody's
terror.
looking at each other. Do you want to talk about Chinese trade? Go ahead.
No, but so I think one of the important things that President James has talked about is the issue of true north and true principles. And it is the Heritage Foundation's position, as far as I understand it, that we stand by the idea of free trade. And we recognize that tariffs, at the end of the day, have a very distinct distorting impact. They also offer, in some ways, sort of a lazy man's way out of saying, well, let me throw a tariff out there. What I would say, in recognition of the president's policies, is it has certainly gotten China's attention. I don't think anyone can doubt that. But at the end of the day, the question has to be, where do we go from here? Is the new normal to basically say, we're going to impose a massive tax on the American consumer by tariffs? Or having gotten China's attention, now the Chinese have something to do with this as well, what is going to be their response? And I think, as you mentioned, after the election is going to be key. If a Democrat gets elected, what happens? By the way, that applies to more than just tariffs. But with regards to trade, what do the Chinese do? And conversely, if President Trump is reelected, what do the Chinese do in terms of their trade policies? If they continue to do intellectual property theft, then obviously there may be a need for even harsher responses. If, on the other hand, the Chinese are prepared to negotiate, we should recognize that maybe in this case the tariffs got people's attention, but that's a really, it's a little bit of a drastic, I'm going to amputate the arm kind of thing. Not generally recommended for, nosebleeds and backaches.
The question is whether it's an opening gambit or the end game.
Correct.
Yeah. Do you want to say something?
No, my only response to the question is, as one conservative's perspective. I mean, generally speaking, I think tariffs are insufficient economic policy. I think they hurt American consumers certainly. At the same time, as someone who's observed what the president has chosen to do, there can be no doubt, as Dean said, that it has forced the Chinese to recognize that they are more vulnerable than perhaps they thought, certainly more vulnerable than even I thought. And to the degree that that has brought a greater situational awareness both to the U.S. side and to the Chinese side, that's benefiting our policies.
Okay. Let's see, which part of the room have I not gone to yet? I think way over here, somebody's waving at me. Okay, to you next. That's how you get my attention, yeah.
Thank you. You hold it. I'm Charlie Dunn from Charlotte, North Carolina. My question is concerning comprehensive approach that you all have talked about. Does that also mean, in your opinion, that China is looking to be aggressive both politically and militarily, globally, the way the Nazis did in World War II?
I think you have, you talked about Africa and what they're doing in Latin America.
I would separate, it's a great question from the standpoint of trying to assess the aggressiveness of the Chinese regime. I would separate domestic from foreign, and then I would separate the foreign piece from their version of a near abroad that was mentioned in terms of India, Pakistan, and the region there, and then extended beyond that. And I think their both calculus and strategy differs on that front. So very quickly on the domestic side, I think it's no holds barred in terms of using the security apparatus to completely suppress the democratic voice inside of China. And you see this with over an estimated 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps, with crematoriums not far from those locations, I might add. So you have a total disregard for human rights as it applies to maintaining the regime in place. In the near abroad, in the East and South China Sea, you see the reefs being built up. They weren't going to arm them, they're armed now, and so you have this desire for dominance in what would be in the Asia context. Further far from that is a Latin America or an Africa where natural resources are what they're after, and the Belt and Road initiatives are coming in with really no constraints from a value standpoint that America would say the strings attached to that are just evil in many ways. And that applies to technology that's being spread with Huawei and ZTE throughout Latin America and Africa, all the way to the indiscriminate mining and other natural resources as well. So I'm sorry to say the answer to your question, it kind of depends what piece of China you're looking at.
Okay. There was someone over there. Yeah, yes, sir.
Thank you. Dave Williams, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I am concerned and would appreciate your comment on whether perhaps free trade principles are being used against us by Chinese in some areas by buying industries in infrastructure or controlling industries in infrastructure that supply the United States at a very good price under the free market system. Raw materials for pharmaceuticals, raw materials for aluminum, for steel, for precious metals, which could be cut off at any time and decimate our electronics industry. I think they have an element of using the free market, our interest in free markets, to control things at the lowest level, which would keep us from producing product, militarily or commercially. Is there any, do you see that as part of their strategy?
Yes, I think it is. For the longest time, we at Heritage have always made what we would call the national security exception to free trade. And by that I mean if the free flow of anything, goods, investments, whatever, if it could be determined that it was a threat to the actual national security of the United States, not necessarily a threat to some particular industry, but to the security of the country and to the American people overall, then restricting that kind of commerce and trade is actually within our line of principles on national security. And much of the areas that you're talking about there in terms of infrastructure and also technology and access to the secrets of our industry and the like, those need to be protected. That's not in the basket of free trade at all. As far as we see it. I think it really comes down very often to this narrow question of tariffs, because tariffs are a tax that the United States government imposes on imported goods, but the tax is imposed on the Americans when they buy the good. And so there is a dual aspect to that makes that very different. And it's also not necessarily done in the protection of the national security, but in these other areas, it's certainly national security. I guess there's some areas that are gray, like currency manipulation and things like that she has to also consider whether or not the whole system is being threatened.
Yeah. Just related to the point, I think as a kind of crystallizing example, fifth generation wireless networks, or 5G, has been the most proximate topic that has come up politically. And it's an excellent example of how we're blending, or how blended, the national security and just general economic concerns are. So for example, 5G is more than just faster phones. The better way to understand 5G is that will be essentially the central nervous system of the next evolution of our economy. It's going to connect everything. It's going to enable everything. Well, for years, American companies have largely seeded the development of the underlying infrastructure technology for these types of networks, and the Chinese government has deliberately subsidized companies like Huawei and ZTE for the development of these networks. And that has allowed for good equipment at cheap costs provided by the Chinese to US networks. The challenge is that as these networks have evolved and become more integrated, they've become more of an explicit national security interest. And where we found ourselves over the last 2 years is recognizing that 5G is coming. It will play this central role in an economic and national security sense. And the significant presence of Chinese manufacturers within that network constitutes a national security threat. And so one of the things, just as a demonstrate, because you are kind enough to provide the resources that allow the three of us to do the work that we do, to get a sense of the return on investment that you're getting, we put out a paper that specifically called on the United States government to treat China like a threat when it comes to 5G networks. And we listed a series of proposed policy implementations that we thought would at least begin to roll back and address this challenge. And the administration very shortly thereafter implemented a number of the same recommendations that we made, including an executive order that gave the Secretary of Commerce the ability to just straight up kill any type of contract or business agreement between the United States and any company, but particularly Chinese companies, that would constitute a threat to national security interests. Huawei and all of its subsidiaries were also put on this Treasury Department's entities list, which prevents them from doing key critical business in the United States and prevents U.S. companies from providing critical services to them. And so these are challenges that the administration, certainly the Heritage Foundation, understands as being critical and essential for engaging. We are engaging those things. But this is going to be a new era, because the distinctions that we've been using between kind of national security and general free markets, unfortunately, those things are blending in a more kind of in-depth way than they have previously. And it's what we, on this stage, and many of our colleagues spend a lot of our time thinking about.
All right, we have time for one more question. Let me go back over here. Over here.
So I grew up, and I think many of us grew up in an era where we refer to China as Communist China. And I wonder what the comments of the panel would be on the accuracy and the usefulness or non-usefulness of changing that reference to fascist China.
So fascism tends to involve hypermilitarization, which is something the Chinese actually have taken great efforts not to do. You could actually arguably say that Mao's China was more fascist because its economy was far more oriented towards the military. But the reason why it's useful to still think of them as communist China is because China is still ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. And it's important to recognize here that when we talk about the Chinese Communist Party, this is not from each according to their needs, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. I mean, that's, universities. Rather, it is a Leninist party. There are no other political authorities allowed in China. So this is still a communist in the Marxist-Leninist and especially Leninist sense. And that's useful because, bizarrely enough, you can find fascist governments that had less control over their population than the Chinese Communist Party does over its population. All of the things that David mentioned about all of that effort at control, Pinochet and Franco did not have as much control over their populations as the way today's Chinese Communist Party does.
Well, thanks to our panelists. Thanks also to our audience members and for the people who asked questions. We could talk about China all day long, but now it's time to move on to the next panel, the rule of law, thwarting the progressive assault on courts and voting. So we're going to take a 2-minute break, and then I'll ask John Malcolm, our Vice President for the Institute of Constitutional Government, to come up and lead our next discussion. Thank all of you for your questions and your attendance. Thank you.